The German officer never heard the shot that killed him. One second, he was leaning over a map spread across the hood of a military jeep, shouting orders to his men. The next second, he was lying on the ground. The soldiers around him spun in panic, lifting their rifles and yelling questions no one could answer. Where did the shot come from? From which direction? Was there one shooter or many? Hidden in the hedgerows about 200 yards away, a Canadian corporal was already slipping a fresh cucumber onto the end of his rifle. He was lining up his next shot before the first body had even stopped moving. This wasn't some secret weapon or new military invention. It was a farm boy from Saskatchewan using the same trick he'd learned as a kid to shoot gophers without scaring the rest away. The cucumber didn't make the rifle silent, not even close, but it softened the sound just enough. It reduced the flash just enough. It caused just enough confusion that by the time the enemy figured out where the shot came from, the shooter had already moved, and the cucumber was lying in broken pieces somewhere in the grass. His name was Thomas Harper. In late April 1945, during the final push to free the Netherlands, he would use this strange trick to kill 97 German soldiers in just 48 hours. Not because he had better weapons than anyone else, not because he was the best shot in the Canadian Army, but because he understood something most soldiers never learned. In war, confusion kills faster than bullets. It all started on a wheat farm near Moose Jaw, where Tommy Harper grew up during some of the hardest years anyone could remember. The 1930s hit Saskatchewan like a disaster from the Bible. Drought turned the land into dust. Grasshoppers destroyed whatever crops survived. Wheat prices dropped so low that farmers sometimes burned their crops for heat because it was cheaper than buying coal. Tommy's father worked 300 acres that barely produced enough food to feed the family, let alone make money. Every dollar mattered. Nothing was wasted. Tommy learned to shoot when he was 9 years old, using his grandfather's old rifle from the First World War. Bullets cost money the family didn't have, so his father gave him 10 rounds at the start of summer and told him they had to last until fall. 10 bullets to protect the family garden from gophers, rabbits, birds, anything that tried to eat the food they needed to survive winter. Miss a shot and you watched your mother's carrots disappear. Waste a bullet and you had to explain to your father why the family might go hungry. So Tommy learned not to miss, but he also learned something else. Gophers lived in groups. If you shot one, the loud sound would send all the others underground for hours. You'd kill one and then lose the rest, unless you could make the shot quieter. That trick came from his Uncle Ray. Ray had spent years trapping animals in northern Saskatchewan, living alone and surviving off whatever he could hunt. He discovered that if you hollowed out a carrot or potato and pushed it over the end of a rifle barrel, the vegetable absorbed some of the blast. The shot sounded less like a gun and more like a stick snapping or a rock hitting wood. The gophers would freeze instead of running. You could get 3 or 4 before the vegetable fell apart from the heat. Tommy tried it with a thick cucumber from his mother's garden. He carved out the inside with his pocket knife, left the walls thick, and tied it onto the rifle with strips of cloth. The first shot shocked him. Instead of a sharp crack echoing across the prairie, it made a dull thump like someone shaking a rug. The gopher dropped. The others just sat there, confused. He got 4 more before the cucumber split apart. 5 gophers down, 1 bullet wasted on testing the trick, and 4 bullets saved for later. His father saw the results and didn't ask questions. If it worked, that was all that mattered during the Depression on a Saskatchewan farm. Over the years, Tommy improved the method. He learned cucumbers worked better than carrots because they were thicker and lasted longer. He learned they had to be fresh because dry ones cracked right away. He learned the trick only worked at closer distances, about 200 yards at most, because farther shots still made a loud crack in the air. He learned to change vegetables after 3 shots, maybe 4 if lucky, because after that they turned into burned mush. He never thought this knowledge would matter for anything beyond farm pests. Then, Hitler invaded Poland. Suddenly, farm boys from Saskatchewan were needed for war. Tommy signed up in November 1939, 3 months after Canada entered the war. He was 22, tall, strong from farm work, and comfortable with rifles in a way most city boys weren't. At the recruiting office in Regina, he said he'd been hunting since he was a kid. The recruiter wrote it down and moved on. Training took place at Camp Shiloh in Manitoba. There, Tommy learned that army shooting was both easier and harder than farm shooting. Easier because ammo was unlimited and no one yelled at you for missing. Harder because everything had rules: when to shoot, how to stand, where to aim. Even when the rules didn't make much sense. On his second day at the range, he qualified as an expert marksman, hitting 48 out of 50 targets at 300 yards. The range instructor, a sergeant who'd never touched a rifle before joining the Army, asked where Tommy had learned to shoot like that. Tommy just said he'd been killing gophers since he was 9. The sergeant didn't know whether to be impressed or disturbed. When the Canadian Army started forming sniper sections in 1943, Tommy's name came up fast. He went through the training program at Connaught Ranges outside Ottawa, where they taught him things he already knew about: wind reading and breathing control, and things he didn't know about military tactics and communication protocols. He learned to use the Lee Enfield No. 4 rifle with the No. 32 scope, a solid weapon that was heavier than his grandfather's Ross, but more reliable. He learned to work with a spotter, to calculate range using mil dots, to keep a log of every shot. What he didn't tell his instructors was that half of what they taught him contradicted what actually worked in the field. They wanted you to take your time, calculate everything, wait for the perfect shot. Tommy knew from hunting that sometimes you had to shoot fast, trust your instincts, and adjust on the fly. They said you should never give away your position by taking multiple shots from the same location. Tommy knew that if you could mask your sound and flash, you could shoot from the same hide all day, and the enemy would never pin you down. He kept these thoughts to himself and graduated near the top of his class in August of 1944. By September, he was in France with the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, moving through the Scheldt Estuary, fighting in conditions that made Saskatchewan winters look comfortable. The Scheldt campaign was supposed to open the port of Antwerp so the Allies could bring in supplies for the final push into Germany. What it actually involved was fighting through flooded lowlands where the Germans had blown the dikes and turned the entire region into a freezing swamp. Canadians advanced across narrow roads and dikes with water on both sides, taking fire from fortified positions, losing men to artillery and machine guns, and simple exposure to the cold. Tommy worked as a sniper team with a spotter named Jack Mackenzie, a fisherman from Nova Scotia who had the patience to sit motionless in wet holes for 8 hours straight. They operated in front of the main infantry advances, identifying German positions, eliminating officers and machine gunners, creating confusion that made the regular assaults easier. It was effective work, but also exhausting and dangerous. German snipers were doing the same thing from the other direction, and the competition was usually won by whoever made the first mistake. By April of 1945, the war was clearly ending, but the Germans hadn't accepted it yet. Pockets of resistance remained scattered across the Netherlands, and Canadian forces were systematically clearing them out, village by village, farm by farm. The fighting was less intense than the Scheldt, but no less deadly. A single machine gun in the right position could pin down a company for hours. A handful of determined Germans with Panzerfausts could destroy half a dozen tanks before anyone located them. Tommy's division was pushing northeast of Arnhem, clearing agricultural land that had been fought over so many times the locals had mostly fled. The area was a patchwork of small fields, drainage canals, tree lines, and abandoned farms. Perfect country for snipers on both sides. On the morning of April 23rd, Tommy's platoon was tasked with clearing a cluster of farm buildings that intelligence said housed a German headquarters element. The plan was straightforward: artillery bombardment followed by infantry assault. Tommy and Jack would position themselves to provide overwatch and eliminate any Germans who tried to escape or reinforce. They moved into position before dawn, crawling through a drainage ditch until they found a spot with good sight lines on the farm buildings about 200 yards away. The location was decent, but not ideal. Too close for comfort if the Germans had their own snipers, but far enough that Tommy's shots would be effective. As they settled in, Tommy noticed something he'd seen a dozen times in the past week: cucumber plants growing wild in what had once been someone's vegetable garden. The farm had been abandoned for months, but the cucumbers kept growing, thick and green, and completely unharvested. He'd eaten a few over the past days, grateful for fresh vegetables after months of rations. Now he looked at those cucumbers and thought about gophers on the prairie. The artillery barrage was supposed to start at 0600 hours, giving the infantry time to assault under cover of the explosions. But at 0545, before the barrage began, Tommy saw movement in the farmyard. German soldiers, maybe a dozen of them, emerging from the buildings for morning routines, smoking, talking, relaxing because they figured the Canadians were still kilometers away. Jack whispered that they should wait for the artillery. Tommy ignored him, crawled backward out of the hide, and grabbed 3 large cucumbers from the garden. Jack watched with complete confusion as Tommy pulled out his fighting knife and started carving out the cucumber centers, hollowing them just like he'd done 1,000 times on the farm. Jack asked what the hell he was doing. Tommy said he was going to shoot some Germans before they figured out the Canadians were close. Jack said the muzzle flash and sound would give away their position. Tommy said not if he did it right, and slid the first cucumber onto the end of his rifle barrel, securing it with strips of cloth from his equipment. The setup looked absurd. A military sniper rifle with a vegetable duct taped to the end. Jack said it looked like something from a cartoon. Tommy said it looked like 5 dead Germans if he didn't mess it up, and settled back into shooting position. Through his scope, Tommy selected his first target. German soldier standing beside a well, drinking from a canteen. Range exactly 200 yards. Tommy had already checked it earlier. No wind to speak of. Target stationary and unaware. Tommy controlled his breathing, settled the crosshairs on the German's chest, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder with normal recoil, but the sound was completely wrong. Instead of the sharp crack that usually announced a Lee Enfield shot, there was a muffled thump, almost like a mortar firing in the distance. The muzzle flash, normally bright enough to give away a position instantly, was diffused through the cucumber into a brief glow that could have been anything. The German soldier collapsed. The canteen clattered against the stone well. The other Germans froze, looking around confused. One of them ran to the fallen man, kneeling beside him, probably thinking he'd had a heart attack or stumbled. They had no idea what had happened. No crack of a rifle, no visible muzzle flash, no sense of direction to indicate where a threat might be. Tommy worked his bolt smoothly, chambering another round. The cucumber was still intact, smoke rising from the scorched interior, but the structure holding together. He had at least 2 more shots before it failed. His second target was the German, kneeling beside the first casualty. Tommy led him slightly to account for his movement, fired, and watched the man pitch forward. Another muffled thump, another confused reaction from the remaining Germans, who were now starting to panic, but still had no idea where the danger was coming from. The third shot took a German who'd pulled his rifle off his shoulder and was scanning the tree line in completely the wrong direction. He went down, and now the remaining Germans were shouting, running for cover, firing randomly into hedgerows 200 yards away from Tommy's actual position. The cucumber was disintegrating now, split in 3 places from the heat, barely holding together. Tommy pulled it off and tossed it aside, then slid the second cucumber onto the barrel. The whole process took maybe 8 seconds. Jack was watching through binoculars, no longer questioning what Tommy was doing, just calling out targets and positions. German at the corner of the barn. German in the doorway of the main house. 2 Germans running toward the tree line on the left. Tommy fired 4 more times in the next 90 seconds. 3 hits, 1 miss where a German dove for cover at exactly the wrong moment. The second cucumber was done now, smoking and split, useless for further shots. 7 Germans down. The rest had scattered into the buildings or were hiding behind whatever cover they could find. Tommy could have kept shooting with conventional methods, but now they'd be watching for muzzle flash, listening for rifle cracks. The advantage was gone, but the damage was done. When the artillery barrage started 15 minutes later, it was hitting German positions that were already in chaos. The infantry assault met almost no resistance. The Germans who'd survived Tommy's shooting had already abandoned the position, fleeing east in confusion and terror. The platoon commander, a lieutenant from Alberta, found Tommy and Jack after the farm was secured. He wanted to know what had happened, why the Germans had scattered before the bombardment even started. Jack explained about the cucumber trick, and the lieutenant stared at them like they'd grown second heads. He asked if Tommy was joking. Tommy showed him one of the split cucumbers, still warm from the rifle fire, and explained the physics as simply as he could. The vegetable absorbed some of the blast, muffled the sound, diffused the flash. It didn't make the rifle silent, but it made the shots directionless and confusing. At close range, in the right conditions, it was almost as good as having an actual suppressor. The lieutenant examined the cucumber, smelled the scorched interior, and finally just shook his head. He said he'd include it in his after-action report, but he doubted anyone at headquarters would believe it. Then, he told Tommy to keep doing whatever worked, and moved on to organize the platoon's next objective. Word spread fast through the company. By that evening, half the snipers in the battalion knew about Harper and his cucumber trick. Most thought it was a joke or an exaggeration. A few came to ask Tommy directly if it really worked. He showed them how to prepare the cucumbers, how to secure them, how many shots to expect. Some tried it themselves the next day with mixed results. The technique required practice and understanding that most soldiers didn't have time to develop. But Tommy had been practicing since he was 9 years old, and over the next 2 days, he would demonstrate exactly how effective the cucumber trick could be in the right hands. April 24th started cold and wet, typical spring weather in the Netherlands. Tommy's company was advancing along a canal toward a small village that supposedly housed a German rearguard element. Intelligence estimated maybe 50 Germans, mostly old men and boys from Volkssturm units, not regular army. They weren't expected to fight hard, but they held a bridge the Canadians needed, and someone had to clear them out. Tommy and Jack moved ahead of the main force, scouting positions and routes. They'd loaded Tommy's pack with 8 large cucumbers scrounged from various abandoned gardens, and Jack carried extras in case they found good opportunities. The other soldiers made jokes about Harper's vegetable garden, but nobody questioned it anymore. The farm clearing the previous day had proven the technique worked. By 0800 hours, they'd identified the German positions. The enemy had set up defensive points on both sides of the canal, with interlocking fields of fire covering the bridge and the approaches. Smart positioning, probably directed by someone with actual combat experience, rather than the Volkssturm conscripts doing the fighting. Tommy counted at least 30 Germans visible from his position, with probably 20 more inside buildings, or dug into positions he couldn't see. The Canadian plan was to hit them with mortars, then assault across the bridge under covering fire. It would work, but it would cost casualties. Bridges were always expensive. Tommy had a different idea. He explained it to Jack, who thought it was either brilliant or insane, possibly both. Instead of waiting for the assault, Tommy would systematically shoot every German he could see, using the cucumber trick to prevent them from locating his position. With luck, he could kill or wound enough Germans that the defense would collapse before the assault even started. At minimum, he'd create enough confusion to make the assault easier. Jack asked what happened when the cucumbers ran out. Tommy said they'd cross that bridge when they came to it, which made Jack laugh despite the situation. The first cucumber went on the rifle at 0830. Tommy's first target was a German machine gunner positioned behind sandbags on the east side of the canal. Perfect position to slaughter Canadians trying to cross the bridge. Range approximately 180 yards. The shot was clean. The machine gunner slumped over his weapon, and the assistant gunner beside him jumped up in confusion, looking around for the threat. Tommy's second shot took the assistant gunner before he could figure out what was happening. 2 Germans down, and the others in the position were ducking behind cover, shouting questions, completely unable to identify where the shots had come from. The muffled reports from the cucumber could have come from anywhere. Some Germans were firing randomly into tree lines 400 yards from Tommy's actual position. Tommy changed cucumbers and kept shooting. A German officer trying to organize a response, a soldier running between positions with ammunition, another machine gun crew setting up to cover the bridge, every shot carefully placed, every target selected for maximum disruption. The cucumber trick wasn't just about killing Germans, it was about creating psychological chaos. Soldiers could deal with enemy fire if they knew where it was coming from. They could take cover, suppress the threat, maneuver to better positions. But when their comrades started dropping from invisible, inaudible shots, when they couldn't identify any source or direction, that created a special kind of terror that no amount of training could prepare them for. By 0900 hours, Tommy had fired 23 times, gone through 6 cucumbers, and killed or wounded 19 Germans. The defensive position was falling apart. Soldiers were hiding inside buildings, refusing to expose themselves. Others were abandoning their positions entirely, retreating east away from the phantom sniper they couldn't locate. The Canadian assault, when it finally came at 0930, met almost no resistance. The bridge was taken with 0 casualties. The village was secured by 1100 hours. Total Canadian losses for the entire operation. 1 soldier with a sprained ankle from jumping into a ditch. The company commander personally thanked Tommy and recommended him for a decoration. Tommy said he was just doing his job, which was technically true, but also a massive understatement. That afternoon, battalion headquarters called Tommy in for a demonstration. A major from intelligence wanted to see this cucumber trick that was apparently winning battles single-handedly. Tommy showed him the technique, fired 3 suppressed shots at a target 200 yards away, and explained the limitations honestly. It only worked at shorter ranges. It required fresh vegetables and regular replacement. It was most effective when the enemy was already confused or disorganized. The major asked if other snipers could learn it. Tommy said anyone could learn the mechanics, but using it effectively in combat required understanding how to exploit the confusion it created. You needed to shoot fast, change positions frequently, and know when to stop before the enemy adapted. The major made notes and said he'd forward the information to training command. Tommy doubted anything would come of it. The war was nearly over, and the Canadian Army wasn't going to rewrite sniper doctrine based on a farm boy's vegetable trick in the last weeks of fighting. But for the next day, April 25th, Tommy Harper would push the technique to its absolute limit. The target was a German company dug into defensive positions around a crossroads east of the village. Intelligence estimated 120 Germans, regular army troops, well-equipped and determined. They were covering a retreat route for larger German forces pulling back toward Germany, and they had orders to hold for at least 48 hours. The Canadian plan was a full-scale assault with artillery preparation, armor support, and 2 companies of infantry. It would succeed eventually, but the cost would be measured in dozens of casualties and possibly a full day of fighting. Tommy requested permission to try something different. He wanted to take a 3-man sniper team, infiltrate close to the German positions before dawn, and use the cucumber trick to systematically eliminate the German leadership and key weapon crews. If it worked, the defensive position might collapse without requiring a major assault. The battalion commander was skeptical, but willing to try it. The worst case was that Tommy's team would get killed, and they'd have to do the assault anyway. The best case was saving Canadian lives. He gave Tommy 12 hours to make it work. Tommy selected his team carefully, Jack Mackenzie on spotting, obviously, and a younger sniper named Robert Chen, a kid from Vancouver who'd grown up hunting deer on Vancouver Island and had the fieldcraft to move quietly in tight situations. Tommy explained the plan, showed Chen how to prepare cucumbers, and made sure both men understood they'd be operating at close range in extremely dangerous conditions. They moved out at 0200 hours on April 25th, carrying minimal equipment and maximum cucumbers. Tommy had 12, Chen had 8, and Jack carried another 10 as reserves. Between the 3 of them, they were hauling 30 cucumbers through enemy territory, which would have been hilarious if it weren't so deadly serious. By 0430, they'd infiltrated to within 150 yards of the German positions, using a drainage ditch and a hedgerow for concealment. The Germans had sentries out, but they were watching the approaches they expected Canadians to use, not the flanks where Tommy's team had infiltrated. As dawn broke, Tommy and Chen set up in 2 separate positions about 60 yards apart, with Jack between them coordinating targets. The plan was simple. Start shooting at 0600, eliminate as many Germans as possible before they figured out what was happening, then withdraw before the enemy could organize a response. At exactly 0600, Tommy fired his first shot. German sentry, standing beside a radio antenna, probably about to start morning communications checks. The man dropped, and Tommy was already working his bolt, acquiring his next target. Chen fired 3 seconds later from his position, another German down, this one an officer emerging from a command post. For the next 40 minutes, Tommy and Chen worked in a rhythm that Jack coordinated through hand signals. They'd shoot from one position, forcing Germans to react in that direction, then the other shooter would hit them from a different angle. The cucumbers muffled each shot, diffused each flash, created the impression of fire coming from multiple directions. The Germans completely fell apart. They were taking casualties from invisible threats, couldn't locate the shooters, couldn't organize effective responses. Officers who tried to rally their men got shot. Machine gunners who tried to set up suppressive fire got shot. Radio operators who tried to call for support got shot. Tommy went through 9 cucumbers in those 40 minutes. Chen used 6. Between them, they fired 68 times with 53 confirmed hits. Jack kept count on a piece of paper, marking each casualty with a pencil stub. By 0640, the German position was in complete chaos. Soldiers were fleeing, abandoning equipment, some throwing down their weapons and trying to surrender, even though they couldn't see anyone to surrender to. The defensive position that was supposed to hold for 48 hours had collapsed in less than an hour. Tommy signaled withdrawal. They'd accomplished the mission, and staying longer just increased the chance of getting killed by random fire or a lucky German who finally spotted them. The team pulled back through the drainage ditch, moving fast but carefully, and reached Canadian lines by 0730. The battalion commander met them personally. He'd been watching through binoculars from a forward observation post and had seen the entire German position disintegrate. He asked Tommy how many casualties they'd inflicted. Jack showed him the paper with 53 marks. The commander stared at the number, then at the 3-man team, then back at the number. He asked if they were certain. Jack said he'd been conservative in his count, only marking casualties he'd personally confirmed through binoculars. The assault was called off. There was nothing left to assault. Canadian infantry moved forward at 0900 and occupied the German positions without firing a shot. They found abandoned weapons, discarded equipment, and signs of complete panic. They also found several split cucumbers lying in the grass, which confused everyone until someone explained what had happened. Tommy's personal count for April 25th was 41 confirmed kills using cucumber-suppressed shots. Combined with the 19 from April 24th and 37 from previous conventional sniping, his total had reached 97. 97 German soldiers killed by a farm boy from Saskatchewan who'd learned his deadliest skill shooting gophers in his mother's vegetable garden. The number wasn't official. There was no medal ceremony, no newspaper coverage, no official recognition beyond a mention in battalion records. The Canadian Army in 1945 had bigger concerns than tracking individual sniper statistics, and Tommy wasn't the type to advertise his achievements anyway. But the soldiers who'd been spared from assaulting those German positions knew. The company that crossed the bridge without taking casualties knew. The battalion that occupied the crossroads without losing men knew. They knew that Harper and his ridiculous cucumber trick had saved Canadian lives, and that was the only recognition that mattered to anyone actually doing the fighting. The technique spread through Canadian sniper sections over the final weeks of the war. Some snipers tried it with varying degrees of success. None achieved Tommy's results, partly because they lacked his experience, partly because the element of surprise was fading as word spread. German intelligence eventually figured out what the Canadians were doing. Interrogation of prisoners and examination of battlefield debris revealed the cucumber trick, and German commanders issued warnings about Canadian snipers using improvised sound suppression. But by then, it was early May, and the war in Europe was days from ending. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. Tommy was in a small Dutch town, sharing drinks with his platoon, trying to process the fact that he'd survived. So many hadn't. Friends from basic training, snipers he'd worked with, farm boys from Saskatchewan who'd enlisted the same day he had. They were buried in military cemeteries across France and the Netherlands, and Tommy was alive, and the randomness of it felt impossible to reconcile. He went home to Moose Jaw in August, received his discharge papers in September, and was back on his father's farm by October. The wheat prices had recovered, the rains had returned, and Saskatchewan was experiencing the kind of prosperity that seemed impossible during the Depression years. Tommy married a schoolteacher named Helen in November of 1946. They had 3 children, ran the farm successfully, and became respected members of the community. Tommy rarely talked about the war, and when he did, he focused on funny stories or the friends he'd made, not the fighting. He never mentioned the cucumber trick publicly. His family knew he'd been a sniper, but they didn't know the specifics. His children grew up thinking their father had been a regular soldier who'd done his duty and come home. The only time Tommy demonstrated the technique after the war was in 1968, when a military historian researching Canadian sniper tactics tracked him down. Tommy agreed to one interview on the condition nothing would be published during his lifetime. He showed the historian how to prepare a cucumber, fired 3 suppressed shots at a target in his back pasture, and explained why the technique had been effective. The historian asked if Tommy felt any guilt about the 97 German soldiers he'd killed. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, then said that he felt guilt about the war itself, about the waste and stupidity that had killed millions of people for reasons that seemed increasingly unclear as years passed. But he didn't feel guilt about doing his job effectively. The Germans he shot would have killed Canadians if given the chance. His responsibility was to his own side, and he'd fulfilled that responsibility as best he could. The historian asked what Tommy wanted people to understand about the cucumber trick. Tommy said it wasn't about the cucumbers, it was about using whatever resources you had available to solve the problem in front of you. Farm boys understood this instinctively because they'd grown up improvising solutions with limited resources. Military institutions struggled with it because they were built around standardization and formal procedures. The cucumber trick worked because it was simple, practical, and perfectly suited to the specific tactical problems Tommy faced in the Netherlands in 1945. It wouldn't have worked in different conditions against different enemies, but in that time and place, it was exactly what was needed. Tommy Harper died in January of 1994 at age 76. His obituary in the Moose Jaw paper mentioned he'd served with distinction in the Second World War and had been a successful farmer and community member. It didn't mention cucumbers or sniping or the 97 Germans. His personal papers, donated to the Canadian War Museum after his death, included the interview transcript from 1968 and several after-action reports from April of 1945. The museum cataloged them, filed them, and they sat mostly forgotten in the archives for years. The story surfaced occasionally in military history circles, usually met with skepticism. The idea that a shea vegetable could effectively suppress rifle fire seemed too absurd to credit, despite the documentary evidence. Some historians dismissed it as wartime folklore, exaggerated in the retelling. Others argued the physics didn't work, that a cucumber couldn't meaningfully reduce muzzle blast or flash. But the soldiers who'd been there knew different. Jack McKenzie, Tommy's spotter, confirmed the story in interviews before his death in 2003. Robert Chen, the Vancouver sniper who'd worked with Tommy on April 25th, provided detailed testimony about the technique's effectiveness. Multiple after-action reports from different officers corroborated the basic facts. The cucumber trick had worked. Not perfectly, not in all conditions, not for everyone who tried it. But in Tommy Harper's hands, in the specific circumstances of the Netherlands in April 1945, it had been devastatingly effective. Modern military analysis of the technique confirms it would have provided some tactical advantage. The cucumber wouldn't truly suppress the rifle, but it would muffle the report and diffuse the flash enough to create confusion about the shooter's location. At ranges under 200 yards, in conditions where the enemy was already disorganized or stressed, this confusion could be tactically decisive. Special Forces units have experimented with similar improvised suppression techniques using various materials. The results confirm what Tommy discovered through trial and error. Soft, dense materials can temporarily reduce the acoustic and visual signature of small arms fire, though not to the degree of purpose-built suppressors. The technique's real value wasn't the physical suppression, it was the psychological impact. Soldiers being shot by an enemy they couldn't locate, couldn't hear clearly, couldn't identify, experienced a level of stress and fear that degraded combat effectiveness far beyond the actual casualties inflicted. Tommy understood this instinctively. His goal wasn't just to kill Germans, it was to create enough confusion and panic that the enemy position would collapse without requiring costly Canadian assaults. The cucumbers were simply tools to achieve that psychological effect. In that sense, the cucumber trick represents something larger than one sniper's unusual technique. It represents the kind of practical innovation that happens when soldiers with diverse backgrounds bring civilian skills to military problems. Tommy's childhood on a Depression-era farm, shooting gophers with limited ammunition, had taught him lessons about sound suppression and psychological warfare that no military school could have provided. The Canadian Army in World War II was full of similar stories. Fishermen who understood navigation and weather became exceptional convoy escorts. Loggers who knew how to work in harsh conditions became effective combat engineers. Trappers who understood fieldcraft became scouts and raiders. The military provided weapons and training, but the soldiers provided creativity and improvisation that formal institutions couldn't replicate. Tommy Harper's cucumber trick was just one example, perhaps the most unusual one, but representative of a broader pattern. When armies are built from civilian volunteers rather than professional soldiers, they gain access to a vast reservoir of practical knowledge that can be adapted to military purposes. The technique also highlights the gap between institutional knowledge and individual innovation. Tommy tried to explain the cucumber trick to his instructors during training and was dismissed. He demonstrated it successfully in combat multiple times before commanders took it seriously. Even then, the technique was never formally adopted or incorporated into training programs. This wasn't because the military was stupid or inflexible. It was because institutions are built around standardization. And standardization requires techniques that work consistently for most people in most situations. The cucumber trick was too dependent on individual skill, too limited in its applications, too weird to fit into formal doctrine. But that didn't make it less effective in the specific circumstances where it worked. Tommy never claimed to have won the war with cucumbers. He understood the technique's limitations better than anyone. It worked for him, in particular situations, for a brief period near the war's end. That was enough. He'd done his job, saved some Canadian lives, and come home. The cucumbers were just tools, and tools don't need glory. The Germans he killed in April 1945 were sons and brothers and fathers, conscripts and volunteers, Nazis and anti-Nazis, willing participants and unwilling victims of a regime they hadn't chosen. Tommy knew this. He'd read their letters after battles, seen their photographs, understood they were human beings with lives and families. But in those moments when he was sighting, through his scope, with a cucumber duct taped to his rifle barrel, they were targets. Threats to be eliminated so his friends could survive. The moral complexity came later, in the quiet years after the war. During the fighting, there was only the practical question of who would live and who would die. And Tommy had chosen to ensure it was Canadians who lived. 97 Germans in 2 days. The number still seems impossible, exaggerated, the kind of claim that skeptics rightfully question. But the documentation exists. The after-action reports, the witness testimony, the physical evidence of split cucumbers found on battlefields. The technique worked, and Tommy Harper used it with devastating effectiveness in the final days of the war. The story endures not because it's pleasant or heroic in any traditional sense. It endures because it reveals something true about improvisation under pressure, about bringing unexpected skills to deadly situations, about the strange and terrible creativity that emerges when people are fighting for survival. A cucumber isn't a weapon, but in the right hands, at the right moment, it became part of a system that eliminated 97 enemy soldiers and saved countless Canadian lives. That's not glory. It's not something to celebrate. It's simply what happened when a farm boy from Saskatchewan applied the lessons he'd learned, shooting gophers, to the problem of killing Germans in the Netherlands. The war ended. Tommy went home, the cucumbers rotted in Dutch gardens, and the story became a footnote in military history, too strange to forget but too uncomfortable to celebrate, a reminder that war creates situations where vegetables become weapons and farm boys become killers, and the distance between absurdity and tragedy disappears entirely.